I think that people love to hold on to power. And we're seeing that right now. Like, why on earth is Nancy Pelosi running for office again? What more does she have to prove? And a lot of these older politicians are saying that there's no one for them to pass the mantle to, which is, first of all, absolutely untrue. But if you, in the past 40 or 50 years of public service, haven't mentored anyone to take over your position, then that's your failure. And quite frankly, it's a shame.
Roxane Gay, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
You say the stakes of the US election are existential. Should Joe Biden step down as the candidate?
You know, I think that's a difficult question. A lot of people are suggesting that he should, as if this country is not as problematic as it is with regards to gender and race. I think Kamala Harris would be an excellent president, and I would love to see her elected. But Hillary Clinton couldn't get elected, and Kamala Harris is coming in with less national experience, even though she is absolutely the vice president and a capable one. So I don't think it's nearly as simple as people are making it out to be, and sometimes you have to go with the bird in hand. That said, perception is reality in politics, and what, for better or worse, the media has made it seem like Joe Biden is not capable of being president. And yes, he does seem frail, and yes, he's absolutely too old for the job, but so is Donald Trump. So if we're going to talk about the age of the candidates, let's talk about his age, and Nancy Pelosi's age, and Bernie Sanders' age, and Mitch McConnell's age. There are a bunch of geriatric people who are currently running this country. And so there's an immediate conversation, but there's also a broader conversation to be had.
Actually, how did American politics turn into a gerontocracy?
I think that people love to hold on to power. And we're seeing that right now. Like, why on earth is Nancy Pelosi running for office again? What more does she have to prove? And a lot of these older politicians are saying that there's no one for them to pass the mantle to, which is, first of all, absolutely untrue. But if you, in the past 40 or 50 years of public service, haven't mentored anyone to take over your position, then that's your failure. And quite frankly, it's a shame.
Now, one of the worst moments in the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump was President Biden losing his train of thought when he was asked about the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Did that moment disqualify him?
I mean, there are so many moments that disqualified both candidates during that debate. But for me, the bigger issue was that Trump said that people are killing babies after they're born, and that's infanticide, and it's a crime in all 50 states. And I simply don't know any person who would ever consider such a macabre thing. And so that Biden didn't have an answer, an immediate "that's nonsense," was really frustrating for a lot of people who believe in reproductive justice and for people who also just believe in truth and sanity. So that was one of many disqualifying things. But, you know, you have to really consider who he's running against. And Donald Trump is crystal clear about who he is, where he stands, and what he will do with Project 2025 if he's elected. And so I feel like a lot of these conversations about Biden are important, but they're also irrelevant because the alternative is Donald Trump. And if that's not terrifying to you, I really do have to question your morality.
Now, of course, you've written throughout your career about movements in progressive culture. Now, thinking about that Donald Trump presidency, is it possible that change as fundamental as marriage equality could go backwards under a second Donald Trump presidency?
I don't even think we need Donald Trump for that to happen because we have a really conservative Supreme Court. And it does not bode well for all of the progress that we have seen over the past 100 years. Clarence Thomas has indicated that he would be open to overturning Obergefell. And as someone who is married to a woman and as a woman myself, that is terrifying because my marriage is the most important thing in my life. And to think that it would become under threat in my lifetime when we've achieved so much it's incredibly disheartening. And it's also unacceptable. We're not going back. We're not giving up our marriages. And literally nothing has happened since gay people got married, other than that gay people have also gotten divorced like everyone else.
And just for the sake of our audience, I should just point out that the decision you mentioned there was the 2015 Supreme Court decision that ended state-level bans on same-sex marriage, obviously a landmark decision. You say you're not going back. So one of the things that the rest of the world finds so hard to imagine is what happens in this circumstance without the kind of casual talk of civil war. This is a progressive change, but as you say, a widespread one. What happens if it comes under attack?
I'm not sure. I don't know if that will be the tipping point to a civil war. I think that a lot of the speculation about civil war is a little misplaced, a little fantastical. Not that it isn't possible, but we're not there yet. You know, history is cyclical. Things are not great, but they have been far worse. And I really think most people need to inform themselves about the cycles of history and recognize that whenever there's progress, there's always going to be retrenchment. And then there's more progress. I'm not saying that we should ever have to fall back. And I'm not suggesting that we don't fight for our marriages, because we will absolutely fight. But we have to recognize that civil war isn't going to solve anything, and it's going to harm the most vulnerable people among us. So we really do have to figure out, how do we preserve all of our freedoms that we absolutely deserve as inalienable rights, and how do we do so without bloodshed? And if we can't do it without bloodshed, then quite frankly, this country does not deserve to exist.
Let me just ask a smaller scale question about marriage, because I read that you said that the formal side of marriage, that it mattered to you and your partner when it came around. Did that take you by surprise?
It did a little bit, because I'm almost 50 years old, and I came out when I was 19, and back then we never believed that marriage equality was possible. And so I think a lot of us told ourselves, I don't need marriage. That's a heterosexual, patriarchal thing that doesn't have any application to my life. And then my wife and I exchanged vows, and there was all of a sudden a shift in the center of gravity, I think, for both of us. And those vows, you know, we took them very seriously. We take them very seriously. And it meant, like, we had already been committed, of course, but now we had this legal bond to one another. But even beyond the legal bond, I think our emotional bond only intensified. And it was an incredible moment. And it has been the greatest decision of my life.
Now, I said in the introduction that your critiques are often trenchant. Sometimes they really bite, but you're also forgiving. Does everyone in public life, whether that public life is on the internet or on CNN, does everyone deserve a second chance?
No, not at all. I think people have to earn a second chance.
And I don't mean criminals. I mean, you know, people in the public sphere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I know what you mean. I think that we really do have to have a rigorous conversation about what redemption looks like. It's really easy to condemn people, and certainly I have condemned many a person for things that I find unacceptable. But if we don't provide the possibility of redemption, what are we saying? That if you make one mistake, the rest of your life, you have to pay for that mistake? I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's reasonable. It certainly does not work with our prison system and our criminal justice system. So I don't know why we think it would work with our social justice system. And so I think that we absolutely have to create space and opportunities for redemption. That said, the people who have done grievous harms have to want to be redeemed. They have to do some of that work toward restorative justice and really thinking about what they've done and really making amends, not to the general public, but to the people they've actually harmed. And unfortunately, thus far, a lot of these conversations about, you know, are people being canceled, blah, blah, blah. No, they're not being canceled. They're facing consequences. And, you know, 5 days later, they're like, oh, I learned my lesson. And I don't know that that's true. And so I just would like to see a little more rigor in how we welcome people back, and also how we hold ourselves accountable when we make mistakes.
Now, at some point, you say you bought into what you described as grossly inaccurate myths about who feminists are. militant, perfect in their politics and person, man-hating, humorless. Who's responsible for creating those myths in the first place?
Well, I think those myths are really designed by men who want to malign women who dare to believe that we are equal, who dare to believe that we are people and that we should have bodily autonomy, that we should be paid the same as men for equal work. And, whenever people are in power and they have it, they don't want to let it go, and they view equality as oppression. And we see that with the ways in which so many people are reluctant to call themselves feminists, and with all of the caricatures that we have about feminists, when in reality, most feminists are really pleasant and awesome and hilarious. And when we're angry, quite frankly, it's an entirely reasonable response when you look at the kinds of issues that we're dealing with and how little progress has actually been made when it comes to women's equity.
And you just mentioned, when we're angry, how far have we come? Do you think women can be publicly angry without being called names? Are we there?
We're not there yet, but sometimes we are. I think it depends on who the woman is. I think, of course, white women have more leeway to be angry. When black women are angry, they're labeled as angry as if that's a personality trait instead of a momentary response to something that is absolutely deserving of anger. So we do have some work to do yet, but are things getting better? As I said earlier, we have made progress. And as someone who very much believes in progress and justice, we have to acknowledge the wins as much as we talk about how much work there is yet to do. Otherwise, I think it's really hard to stay motivated for continuing to create change.
You just reminded me about Barack Obama, because I think he said that he worked very hard not to appear angry, not to be an angry black man. Was that just a political necessity, or was it a form of weakness?
Oh, that was a political necessity. He simply did not have a choice. He would have never been able to accomplish what he did during the 8 years of his presidency if he had been angry. And during one of the White House Correspondents' dinners, he had a comedian serve as his anger translator. And the reason it was so funny is because most of us understood that the anger translator was saying all of the things that President Obama was never going to be able to say. So, there's no such thing as weakness when it comes to doing what you need to do to get the job done.
Now, you started out in the edgy, more private world of early bloggers. I'm talking about your public writing persona. Do you miss that smaller world?
I do miss that smaller world because, my writing remains earnest. I care about what I care about, and I mean what I say when I write, but the deeper I get into my career, the more intimately aware I am of how significant my audience is. And that audience talks back because of social media. Back when we were blogging, oftentimes, maybe 30 people would read what you had to say. And that meant something. It was so thrilling. Like, oh my gosh, 30 people know who I am. And so it was exhilarating in that very small way, but it was also freeing because only 30 people read what I had to say. And of those 30 people, certainly people might disagree, but you weren't going to get death threats. You weren't going to be called terrible names necessarily. And you weren't going to have to be held to an unreasonable standard of having to always be right, having to always be perfect. Sometimes we get it wrong, and we're supposed to. I think that makes things interesting. If someone's right all the time, I wouldn't personally trust them that much. How do you know?
Now, we think of you as being a courageous writer, often a boundary rider, telling us where the boundary should be and where it should shift. But given the feedback, given social media, do you ever find yourself checking what you say, just being a tiny bit less courageous?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't love that about myself. But especially over the past 6 or 7 years, I've really had to gird myself to say the things that I feel need to be said. And there are times when I'm simply not up for the backlash that I know I'm going to get. First of all, I'm not paid nearly enough to have to tolerate some of the nonsense that comes with what I do. But also, I just, the older I get, the less tolerance I have for being treated really badly. And I wish that we had a better caliber of public discourse. I wish we could disagree without it reverting to name calling. I wish that I could have an opinion without someone telling me I'm ugly. What does that have to do with what I said? I just wish we could all be better, and I include myself in that. And maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't, but I do try to be courageous as often as possible. Or I don't really know that I think of it as courage. I think of it as being willing to do the scary thing while being scared. And most of the time I do.
Willing to do the scary thing, ain't that the truth? Now, just thinking about I'm thinking about where this gift of yours comes from. You talked about your mother. You said she didn't necessarily know it at the time, but she constantly modeled what it is to have convictions and the confidence to express them. I was very moved by that. Where did she learn it from?
I think she also learned it from her mother. She was raised in a really loving household with 10 siblings, and her mother loved each and every one of her children and encouraged the girls in particular to have a voice. And she also encouraged her sons to protect her daughters. And so I know that my mom grew up confident because she knew she was safe to be confident. She knew she was safe to have opinions and to express them. And she's married to my dad, who's great. And so she married a man who not only listened to her, but he celebrates her positions and her stances. He recognizes her brilliance and honors it and isn't intimidated by it. And so all of these things, I think when you're well loved, it's much easier to say what you mean and what you think.
I wanted to just ask you a question about representation, because I know that you love television and film, and you watch all the movies, and you've also spent time in writers' rooms yourself. Clearly, representation is changing, but you say you're still not seeing yourself on TV or in fiction. Why is that?
I think change is incremental. I also know that a lot of times people don't recognize that for Black women, for example, we're not all the same. We contain multitudes. And so when we're telling stories about Black people, about people of color more broadly, we have to tell a range of those stories. And we have to tell funny stories and difficult stories and, really interesting murder mysteries, whatever. It doesn't matter. But let's center different kinds of people in those stories and just women in general. So much of film and television storytelling is about men. It's a bunch of men talking to each other while wearing suits, in a room and looking very ponderous. And yeah, it's all well and good, but there are so many other stories to tell. And Hollywood seems so reluctant, even though time after time, when you put really great television or film on the screen that is diverse, but the diversity isn't treated as something that is done to address representation, but is done because there's rich storytelling to be found, it works. And people love it, and they crave it, and they want more. And yet still, it's so difficult. I think of a show in the United States, but I think it's also available internationally, called Reservation Dogs. That was so interesting and so funny and so smart. And I would love to see 10 other shows, not in that same vein, but that give creators that kind of leeway to try different things. And sometimes they're going to get it right. Sometimes they're not. But unfortunately, creators of color are always put in the position of having to be perfect, or no one else gets to make something. And so that's why we see a lot of neutered content, a lot of neutered film and television, and sometimes even books from people who know I have to play it safe so that someone else gets a chance to play it at all.
Let me just ask you about books and writing. Should everyone be able to create any character they want?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Anytime someone asks, can I write someone who's different from me? Can I, I'm a white woman, can I write a novel about an Asian cowboy? Do whatever you want. But you have to recognize that when you do those kinds of things, you are going to be under scrutiny. And if you don't do it well, you're going to learn that you didn't do it well. And so you have to be willing to tolerate the feedback that you're going to get. And not everyone is going to celebrate your right to write freely. But the minute that we start to constrain people and suggest that we can only write from our subject position, we're saying that we only want to look at boring things all the time. And storytelling, especially fiction storytelling, is supposed to be fictional. The reason that there's often pushback against people who do write across difference is that they just do it badly. And those seem to be the people that get the biggest opportunities. But there are lots of people that are doing it really well, and I hope that their work gets elevated. And I also hope that we just stop having these sort of entry-level conversations like, can you? Like, of course you can. I think the better question is, like, how do you do it well? And why do you want to do it?
Roxane Gay, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you so much for the great questions.